Good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
This is March
Here
15th,
we are.
2021, episode 179 of Transmission.
And if you see Caesar on the road, kill him.
Wow, that's an innovation from the original saying.
Yes. It's combining two things great contemplative philosophy and Western European history.
Nice. I like it. But that's not the right saying, Dan. And that you have to do it the right way.
The right
It's
way.
not worth doing, which is what we're
Nice
talking about.
segue.
Yeah, I'm
Nice
pretty proud of that
segue.
subtle segue that I just did. We're talking about purity culture today, and I think we're going to have 3 episodes this week, right?
We are.
We've said that we've
We're
promised
gonna
this.
do it.
We've promised it, and they've never delivered. But you get a triple shot of purity this week.
That's right.
Pure goodness from Transmission. Yeah. So just to pull up a comment, people are saying, "Good morning, morning, friends. Hope you're feeling better soon, Mark." If I'm sluggish, it's because I am reacting to my COVID shot. It's not because I'm dull-witted. Just so people, first time watching, thinking that guy's kind of slow. It's because of sickness, not because of my innate mental capacities.
Sure. We just always.
I don't know what this is, but you SOB, I'm in. Yeah, we can always. I'll just use that anytime I seem like I'm not amazingly, sparklingly witty. It's because I'm sick. Just assume that, everybody.
Yeah, it's like in those old crappy, colonial British movies. I feel my malaria coming back to me. I just use that.
Yes,
that's my COVID shot. It's coming back to me. We should introduce ourselves.
Yes.
Because obviously we've created a great stir on the interwebs.
Indeed. I'll start. I'm Mark Van Steenwyk. I direct the Center for Prophetic Imagination.
And I'm Daniel Wolpert. I direct Micah, the Minnesota Institute of Contemplation and Healing.
And before we were talking about our very different experiences of this thing called purity culture.
Yes, Mark is much purer than me. What it came down to.
Everyone suspected that this whole time anyway. I'll set it up a little bit and give a little bit of weave in some of my biography into that. So when people say purity culture, usually what is particularly meant is this movement that started mostly in the 90s among the sort of Christian contemporary scene of true love weights, abstinence-based education initiatives, purity rings, all that sort of stuff that's part of tied up around sex. And you can see that kind of spiraling into different kinds of culture war areas about what is proper sexuality. But that ties in, of course, to a larger tradition in Christian conservatism of seeing Christianity as about moral excellence, as defined by a kind of a strict interpretation of Scripture. So that's not new. But then if you even step back even further, that's sort of like right or wrong way of approaching spirituality. Further, you can see that in some of the more pernicious parts of what people are calling cancel culture, where it's very performative based. So there's no sense of transformation. It's like if someone fucks up, then they're cut off. So have sex before marriage. Now you're never going to have God's best for you. If you use the wrong language to talk about something or kind of, then there can be a reactive thing. So there is some kind of piece to purity culture that translates outside of religious cultures. And so that's what we're talking about today. And for me, I'm the poster child of 90s purity culture in a lot of ways. So I experienced this on the inside and out.
Right. Now, obviously, as you said, this isn't new, right? So we do have the Puritans, which
it's in the name.
Yeah, it's in the name. Right. Yeah. So, as the Reformation got going in Europe, there was a lot of focus on the issue of clerical abuse and misconduct. There was a lot of focus on the whole issue of what are called indulgences, which means basically buying your way out of committing sins.
Mm-hmm.
So, you could commit a sin, and if you did a certain thing or paid a certain amount, you could get that sin forgiven. And, and a lot of people didn't like that. And I mean, there were people that didn't like it for religious reasons. But there was also a lot of politics behind all of this. And I think people tend to want to forget all of that. Henry VIII in England basically was going broke, trying to compete with Spain and Portugal for colonization and the wars that were happening in Europe. And the monasteries in England had a ton of money and gold and, valuable stuff. And so he's like, hey, if I jump on the Reformation bandwagon, I can steal all their stuff.
That's right.
And and so there were multiple issues and reasons that this was happening, but in England you did have this movement towards connecting directly with the Holy Spirit, right? So the Quakers, the Shakers, the Ranters. I mean, there's all kinds of interesting things happening. And so a lot of focus became on this direct relationship with God, which you could mess up if you did something bad. And so that was the thing, was that you want to have this good relationship with God, and you want to have this good Holy Spirit experience. But if you did something naughty, then God wouldn't like you anymore.
And this is a hard concept, because it's not entirely wrong. Like, if I go off and murder someone with my bare hands right now, which I try not to do on a Monday usually, but if I do that, it's probably going
your COVID shot.
Yeah, it's probably going to breed alienation in my soul. It's going to affect me,
right?
And that'll affect my relationship with God and myself. So obviously, if you do shitty things, it's going to affect you. But that's different than saying, like, I need to perform this in order to be right with God, and then being very strict about these things that, there's no discernment involved. It's like really about trying to suss out the rules and follow them, whether you are really into it or not, whether it's transformative or not, whether or not it's coming from a place of compassion or wisdom, none of that. So sex is a great example for this. The amount of shame and performance based around like purity and sex has a really, ironically, people trying to adhere to that too strictly causes the alienation. More alienation than if they were just to hop into an orgy and enjoy themselves, which we were talking about beforehand, because I was making fun. Dan grew up more on this sort of like with the hippie vibe, and I grew up like, I saved myself for marriage. I wore the Christian t-shirts to high school. I remember the 2 DC Talk songs about waiting till you're married before you have sex. Still to this day, the lyrics are just ensconced in my mind. All sorts of that stuff. Meanwhile, Dan was having hippie orgies on acid, like, or whatever.
Which would you pick? Right.
If I had to choose between the two at this point, I don't really regret like getting married young and being married to Amy, but I also recognize like I don't want my son to go down that same sort of way of approaching things necessarily. So
we got a lot of comments.
There's coming in.
Fun and goofy.
Let's see. Let's scroll through here.
Laura's listening live because there's a lot of snow in Denver.
Michelle writes, "Purity culture sucks." Shouldn't use the word "sucks." It's a little.
Yeah. No, and that's actually a great example of that. I did not know that "sucks" is a swear word.
I didn't either. Like, because my dad is a Navy vet.
Yeah.
So like even in Christian culture, I was never quite a perfect fit because we're a cussing family.
Yeah, and I actually used that in a sermon once. And,
you naughty boy.
Well, it was funny. It was afterwards. Somebody came up to me and says, you really shouldn't swear in your sermons." And I was thinking back, and I was like, I didn't swear. And so I had to ask them. I said, "Well, what swear word did I use?" And they said, "Well, you said sucks." I was like, "Sucks is a swear word?" I didn't even know. I still really don't believe it, but obviously in some people's lexicon, it is.
Yeah, that's
So
another part of purity culture, like that. Obviously, I rail against this idea that you can't cuss. It drives me bonkers. Like I remember in our rural, charismatic Minnesotan conservative church, we had an Irish charismatic on the
yeah.
speaking circuit come in. In the sermon, he used the word bitching and moaning and bitching like all the time, and people were like, "What do we do with this?" And he's like,
um,
and he was flabbergasted that we think of that as a swear word. And of course, anytime I've sworn in a sermon, which has happened, sometimes people get upset, and then these are in progressive churches. So that's another aspect of purity culture. Aaliyah says, I kissed dating goodbye, goodbye. For those who are not in the know, I kissed dating goodbye is kind of the seminal text on courting and not dating, not having sex before marriage, but instead courting your true love till marriage. So like all these high schoolers and early 20 people preparing themselves to get married because of this book. And then the great thing is this dude who wrote it said, "I'm sorry, I shouldn't have written that shit."
yeah.
But he's still making, now he did a documentary about how he feels bad about it. So he's still cashing in on it to this very day. Chris asks, can I describe the side effects of purity culture or the COVID shot? I feel achy, aches, pains
kind of
for
out
both.
of it.
Out of it. That's the answer to both of those. Yeah. So Chris writes, and I don't know what the context of this is, so I don't know whether to agree with you or argue. When you go against nature, then nothing good comes of it due to the fact that nature knows and shows best. Nature is a really big concept, so I don't know what you mean by that.
Well, and again, I'm not sure exactly what you mean either, Chris. But one of the, I think, important things about this issue with purity culture is that it actually is very consciously, right, anti-nature, in the sense that the theology is, right, that humans in their fallen state, right, in their nature state, are bad. And so by being, pure, we're trying to get to some sort of higher state and better state.
Yeah.
And so anyway.
The nature thing in the context of purity culture and evangelicalism in particular is fascinating because nature is to be resisted except for when you can use it as an argument. So the idea of heterosexuality is supposed to be normative. It's because other acts are unnatural.
Right.
And then if you say, look at those two bonobo males fucking each other, they're like, wait, not like that. Not that kind of natural. Right. And so the idea is that it's a created order. And so even nature itself has to submit itself to God's divine authority. And so then it gets to like, what do you even mean by nature at this point? Chris writes, Council of Nicaea, tons of books banished from the records. I mean, this is also, again, an impulse towards purity. Like orthodoxy is a purity test of a sort. So a kind of a strident dogmatism. I mean, we've been dealing with this from day one.
Yeah.
Even Paul, the arguments about whether you need to be circumcised or not is a good example of this.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Ceres writes, not to mention that Henry VII or VIII, I'm assuming, left Catholicism for politics and for ditching his first wife. Yeah, there wasn't a lot of religious piety behind his actions, really.
No.
Chris also writes, what's also interesting is that the rapture is only a 120-year-old interpretation from the Bible. There's all sorts of innovation. That's the other piece to this. Like these sorts of conservative Christian cultures, particularly evangelicalism, are often very innovative, but they're acting like they're holding on to
their original. Yeah.
It's one of these classic bait and switches. Gus writes, it's a very anything worth doing is worth doing well. Seems like the logical end to the thinking that drives the Protestant work ethic. I like Father Greg Boyle's version. Anything worth doing is worth failing at it.
Do it poorly.
That's
Well, and
helpful.
so this to me is one of the I think important things to realize with this. And Mark, you hinted at this earlier when you're talking about your murderous impulses, which is that abusive religion, right? What abusive religion is about is not necessarily about uniquely abusive things or ideas, right? Although, I mean, it can be some of that. But more often, what it really is about is it's about taking positive ideas and concepts and taking them way too far, right? Taking them way too far, taking them to a point where they now become abusive to people, where they're now about shame and control and domination and fear. Right. So, again, starting off with the basic idea that all spiritualities are about, at some level or another, behaving well. Right? I mean, that's not a bad idea.
Right action. I mean, that's a very Buddhist
Yeah.
idea, and it's also very
Yeah.
Christian. Like
Yeah.
most religions have a right action idea, and
Yeah.
that's important.
Yeah. So, starting out with that, but then going to the point of I have to now relate to myself from this judgmental, hyper vigilant, fear based state where there's this, evil, crazy, psychotic warlord in the sky out to get me for any, wrong thing that I do. Okay, that now is very abusive.
Mhm.
And so I think that's a sort of a helpful frame for all of this. It's almost like the dial gets turned way too far, and so what needs to be introduced, and I think in some ways, Gus, what you're talking about is part of that. I mean, what needs to be introduced is compassion, and as you said, Mark, discernment and wisdom.
And
Right, so that
curiosity,
yeah,
which is the first thing to go in these sorts of dogmatic systems.
yeah, yeah, and some sense of space, right, where we can now kind of function as a human and breathe and be kind and relate to each other and to God in a thoughtful way.
It's interesting, and this is kind of anticipating one of the comments we'll pull up in a second here. But for me, part of I've had several areas where I started journeying away from a sort of dogmatic evangelicalism. And one area was me kind of realizing, like, okay, technically speaking, according to my evangelical thinking, my heterosexual marriage is better than this lesbian marriage that I knew about these people that I was, tangentially friends with. But then I understood deep down inside that in some ways their marriage was better. Like they were more considerate towards each other and gentle and loving than I felt like I was. Not like I was a horrible husband at the time, but it was just I could see the excellence in their actions. And I started thinking, like, well, this blows my mind. Like I have to, at a certain level, affirm the goodness of their marriage. Mm-hmm. And so that broke it open for me. Like, okay, it's not about adhering to the letter. It's about the spirit of the thing. And if I look more into that, then I can start seeing way more flexibility and discernment. And it was part of this recognition for me that, avoiding slippery slopes is not the goal of a Christian life. In fact, it's about living on the slippery slopes all the time. And how do you keep movement in a way in the positive direction? And that, of course, that's once you start thinking that way, it's hard to stay evangelical.
Right.
And then
now then the other big thing that we haven't even touched on yet here is that this drive towards purity culture, which again also in many ways came out of the fleeing from Europe of a lot of these groups, is that the drive towards purity culture lifted up, right, individual action and sin as the most important thing.
Yes.
Right. And tended to completely forget about social sin and action and behavior. Right. And so, a wrong sexual act was now a lot worse than, carpet bombing a city. And so, that is a whole other piece to this, which I think it'd be great to, in one of our other episodes this week, to kind of look at.
Yeah, I think we're looking at the power dynamic and how it's used to kind of control people, keep them in their
yeah, exactly. And so people now become really laser focused on my behavior, and you kind of forget about everything else that's going on around you in society, and as if God doesn't care about any of that. And all God cares about is what am I doing with my genitals. It seems like sort of a limited focus for God.
And that's why religious conservatism and political conservatism tend to lump in together, because of that sort of emphasis on the individual act versus systems. Elias writes, my wife's family's from Toronto. Her family was okay with the word shit, but everything else is bad. Shit sometimes, especially in like agrarian cultures, tends to be like my pastor would say shit if he was talking about cow shit. It was okay, but if he said shit when he stubbed his toe, it'd be bad. Like that's how it was in my context. Don writes, how do you feel about the Catholic Church's pronouncement against gay unions? I didn't hear the pronouncement, but that sounds bad. Like that's what I feel about it.
Well, I mean, they've always been against that. I don't know if there was some new recent pronouncement, but yeah, I mean, they've always been against that. And I think that one of the interesting things, of course, that this brings up, right, is I think a question that rarely gets asked among people, especially who are promulgating all this stuff, which is, is any of this purity sort of even possible, right? And because if you look at the behavior of people, often the behavior of people who are the biggest promoters of this, and you mentioned this one guy that wrote this book and then got divorced and then said, oh, this was all a bad idea. People are not practicing this purity. People have all kinds of desires. People behave in all sorts of different ways. Most of the popes throughout history that were promoting a lot of purity, had wives, had kids, were gay. I mean, we're doing all kinds of stuff. I mean, it just the whole thing. If you look honestly at the way we function, is nonsense, right? And so, it's very hard to admit that if you're in that realm. And it's also very hard to have any sense that it makes any difference, right? As far as, how your life goes or how seemingly God treats you. So I think that, we make these pronouncements and church bodies make these different pronouncements. And I think we're not very honest about the fact that in a way it's all sort of this very sad, abusive nonsense.
Amen. Joyce writes, isn't it also about trying to be good enough, making one's self pure?
Yeah.
And then also doubling down on whiteness. I mean, that's another thing, is like how the concept of whiteness that we've developed ties into this purity thing.
Well, it very much ties into it.
Much ties. And so that's part of the policing that happens. And we talk about tone policing and different kinds of policing that's done around morality and social expectations, often is done, and I'm assuming we're going to talk about this in greater depth, done to sort of maintain a people and keep certain people in dominance. Like we don't, that concept never would have occurred to me when I was in the middle of purity culture, because it was about doing what's right before God and we're all equal before God. But the subtleties of it, once you see it everywhere, because it's really about keeping people in their place. Chris writes, if homosexuality exists in nature, then it's not wrong according to my view. That's good. Again, like maybe someday we should talk about what nature means, because that'd be an interesting topic. Stefan writes, I think it was Gregory of Nyssa who taught that God created Adam and Eve, humans, as male and female because he foresaw the fall, like having sex is a concession to the fall. There's a lot of weird anti-sex thinking, and it's easy to make fun of at this point, but it really was coming from this sort of ideal about subordinate the physical to, to the spiritual, and it makes sense they'd kind of go there, but it's a really bad move.
Well, and I think the other thing about this, just sort of giving ourselves a little slack here, right, is that to recognize, right, that human physical existence is hard and scary, right, and I mean, you look at what we're struggling with now with this pandemic, and out of nowhere, this little invisible disease appears and attacks us, and all this wild, crazy stuff happens, and so I do think that there is a somewhat not unreasonable idea that I want to try to live in a way to avoid as much of this suffering as possible, right? So, we're arguing about wearing masks. We're, running off and injecting some invisible thing into our arm. Humans have always tried to do all kinds of stuff to avoid suffering. And so I think that in some ways this, and again, with the idea that we're starting out with an idea that isn't so awful, and then it goes to a big extreme, right? So, if you look at the plagues of the Middle Ages, a lot of them came about because of the fact that people would take their feces and just throw it out the window onto the street, and then it would get all over people's clothes and shoes and stuff and food, and and so somebody could come back and say, well, you're into this purity culture because you say people shouldn't eat their shit. It's like, well, yeah, I guess in some ways, but in some ways that's actually kind of a good idea. Like, don't eat your feces and you will be less ill. And so it's
self-control is a good thing unless it becomes a very stifling, shaming
becomes thing. A bad thing.
It becomes a bad thing. Stefan says, in the sense, without the fall, we would procreate without having sex. That takes the fun out of it. Elias writes, was that the Gregory who cut off his junk? I thought it was Origen who cut off his junk. Maybe there was a Gregory out there who cut off his junk.
Origen definitely did. Gregory may have also.
Yeah. Ceres writes, purity culture is so much more about fixating and saviorism than ethics. Purity culture ignores ethics and integrity. Yes.
Okay. Well, that kind of gets down. So Don, let me skip over it. Don had a question here somewhere about right. Are there any norms? We're coming to the end of this segment. See, this is what's great about having 3 segments. So I want to pick up some of this stuff.
Any norms?
And that's often the thing that people who are in favor of this will say, like, well, if you don't have these rules, like soon people will be, having sex with animals and children and like doing all these horrible things. And, and so just to get back to this idea that the basic notions, right, of ethics in terms of that we are loving to ourselves and to others, and that when we're engaged in a relationship, we do things consensually, and children don't have the same consensual mechanisms as adults, and so we have to treat them differently, and all of those sorts of things are very, very important and are very good, right? And it really, when we're talking about this purity culture, what we're talking is that those basic sorts of norms drift into this area of abuse, right? Where the norms themselves now become not life-giving, but death-dealing, to use that kind of discernment language.
Let's get to a couple more. Hadassah, I hope I pronounced that right. I wish I'd saved myself for my husband who truly loves me and cherishes me. I'm 37 and a half, and I look back at the choices I made in my early 20s. Yeah, like, this is interesting for me because I don't feel bad that I saved myself from marriage. But at the same time, I realized the reason I did wasn't good. Like, it sounds like to you would want to save yourself for a positive desire for intimacy and love. And even though that was the language used in the church for me, it was really more about shame and not screwing up. And so it was almost entirely couched in a negative. And then it was overpromised that if somehow you save yourself from marriage, sex will be amazing. And that's not how it works. So there's the idea of, there's some about that idea of saving yourself from marriage that's good and healthy and beautiful if thought about in the right way, but making it some sort of coercive mandatory gets really toxic real quick.
Well, right. And so to really clarify what we're talking about, I mean, for each individual person, if they want to make a particular decision for themselves that they feel is positive and life-giving, that's great, right? That's great. And if it involves another person who is consenting and it is also a loving, positive decision, then that's also great. The issue is not the particular actions, right? The issue is, what is the religious overlay, right? So to say, okay, because I did X, Y, or Z in my 20s, now I may personally feel like, oh yeah, some of those decisions were painful and difficult, and maybe now looking back, I wouldn't have done all of them. That's different than saying, oh, because you did that in your 20s, now this old guy in the sky hates you, and when you die, you are going to go get tortured for eternity, right? So that's a whole other overlay.
Or like, God will let you into heaven because he beat the shit out of his son instead of you, and so but he really would have rather done it to you. Like, so that's still, I mean, I guess that's better than suffering in hell, but begrudgingly, God goes along with it begrudgingly or something. That's kind of the.
Right. So we've got a ton of comments here. We're over time.
Take a couple.
We'll take a couple more, and then we'll be back on Wednesday to talk more about this.
Yeah, Leah says the Vatican said they can't bless gay unions. Nothing new, but people are hoping that union blessing would be approved since gay marriage was out. Cannot bless a sin was the pull quote. Also said that homosexuality was a choice. So yeah, bad. Predictable, but yeah, I could see how that'd be heartbreaking if you had a glimmer of hope that things could change. Catherine, you haven't heard from Catherine yet today, so let's pull this up. The weirdest and most telling thing about 90s purity culture looking back is the widespread casual acceptance of invasive authoritarian control of something that is incredibly subjective, intimate, and personal. There is a moral panic aspect to it, and also really creepy power dynamics within a lot of the purity projects.
Right. Yes. No, exactly.
Great observation.
Exactly. Yep.
Yeah, it's hard to pick. Like, we have time for maybe one more comment, so I'm like sorting through. I guess I'll give the last one to Elias here, and then we'll transition out. Do you think it's possibility that Jesus could have meant that they will not marry, be given to marriage? They'll be as the angels could possibly be pointing forward that polyamory could be permissible. Not for me, lol, but maybe for others. Yes. Like, it's interesting. A lot of the stuff against sexuality in scripture has more to do with, not that this is that much better, with property rights and lineage more than it has to do with some sort of like enjoying yourself is bad. We put a spin on it. And if we assume that God is not male, but gender full, and that somehow being sexual is part of our nature, then I'm assuming there's going to be something similar to sexual enjoyment in heaven. I don't understand why we think there wouldn't be. It's just, there's no need, if we're using the logic of having descendants that you can trace back to the patrilineal line, and couples kind of own, like a man kind of owning his wife, that's part of patriarchal society, And in heaven, that patriarchal relationship's gone. Then you can have all kinds of sex without any sort of concern. So why, like who's the father? Like, you know what I'm saying? And you don't have angel babies. So why not?
So you're gonna get that 60s orgy after all, Mark.
Yeah, when I die and I go to the good place. And it's going to be
all right. Well, this
be great.
Is great. Well, this is great. Great to be with everybody. And yeah, we'll be back on Wednesday to continue this topic and maybe
Part 2.
where we're ending up here in terms of this issue of marriage and patriarchy and property rights and stuff. Might be a great place to start. Power.
And then I have some ideas of where we might go for part 3, but we'll see. We'll see what happens. See you Wednesday,
all
everybody.
Right. See y'all.
Peace.